So what is succession then? Succession is the change that occurs in communities in terms of the species composition over time. And many people often think of succession as sort of akin to thinking about developmental changes that occur in organisms. If you think about an embryo that changes to a fetus, that changes to an infant, that grows into a young child, that grows into an adult, that there are these sort of developmental stages that individuals go through, or individual organisms go through, from conception all the way through to adulthood. By the same token, but less predictably, communities can also follow developmental stages over time. So they're not quite as discrete or as uniform as maybe individual organisms developing, but the overall concept is the same. Okay, so you see a community with a certain species composition, and over time, those species that are there tend to be replaced by other species, and the community changes. Okay, and so succession can result from both biotic factors as well as abiotic factors that are happening around it. And there's two main types of succession. Okay, so the example of the volcanic eruption at Mount St. Helens is an example of primary succession, and we're going to talk a little bit more about other primary successions in a bit more detail here. But a primary succession, therefore, is succession that involves colonization of habitats that are completely devoid of life. Okay, so when the volcano spews lava and destroys everything, there's basically nothing left for a while. That's an example of a disturbance that can lead to primary succession. Other kinds of disturbances that can lead to primary successions are the retreat of glaciers and strip mining by humans. Okay, so basically you're getting rid of all the soil. You basically have just dead rock or bare bedrock upon which organisms have to be able to figure out how to grow, and communities have to figure out how to establish themselves from that point. Okay, so that's primary succession. The other type of succession is called secondary succession. And secondary succession occurs in areas that have been disturbed in some way, and then organisms have to be reestablished in that area, but that not all of the organisms have been completely destroyed like in a volcanic eruption. So there still is probably soil that's going to be present in the case of most communities. So things that can be disturbances that destroy a lot of stuff but not necessarily kill everything are things like fires, storms, farms that have been abandoned, logging. Okay, so these can create big disturbances but not wipe everything back to square one. And so that's what we mean by a secondary succession. So the example of Mount St. Helens is an example, is an example of a primary succession where the initial blast occurred in 1980 in May, and by 1997, which is 17 years later, much of the area that was initially covered by ash and mud flow had developed low-lying vegetation, and new trees started to sprout up between the old dead tree trunks. Here you can see some new trees and dead trees. And so this biotic community, this biological community, was beginning to redevelop in this place that was devoid of life. Again, a primary succession. So primary succession involves stages that communities go through. Okay, the earliest stages are called pioneer stages, and then we can see some intermediate stages, and the final stages, or the final community that tends to be relatively stable once the development has taken place, is called the climax community. Okay, now this slide is an example of kind of a predictable primary succession that might take place in a temperate deciduous forest area. Okay, and notice that the time that we have time along the axis here, not really space. Okay, so primary succession can take hundreds to thousands of years. Okay, so it can take a really long time. I know that Mount St. Helens, we said within 17 years we had some growth there, but sometimes to finally reach the final end of the primary succession, if there is such a thing as a stable climax community, which is kind of debatable, is going to take hundreds of years. Again, maybe maybe thousands, maybe more than 1,000 years. Okay, so this diagram shows time, not space. You wouldn't go out and see this picture here. You would be following these stages, one point in time, another point in time, another point in time, another point in time. Okay, so what we're starting with here is bare rock from some kind of a disturbance. And then the pioneer stages or the pioneers are the first organisms to come in. Things like lichens. We talked about lichens when we were talking about mutualisms, right? Lichens are those kinds of organisms that can grow on bare rock because they form the mutualistic association with algae that allows them to get nutrition. And after a time, lichens build up. They can provide some surface. When they die, they can provide some organic material for mosses to grow. Okay, and then mosses tend to build up, and then when they die, they can add organic material together with the breakdown of rock. And what we see here that happens in primary successions is that soil is beginning to form over time. Again, this can take decades. So soil formation is a critical stage in a primary succession, and again, one of the major reasons for why it takes so long. Okay, so soil is forming from, again, breakdown of inorganic minerals from rocks. Lichens and mosses can secrete acids that break it down, together with abiotic influences, the cracking of rock from weathering. So that inorganic material mixes with the dead bodies of plants and mosses and lichens, and that all of that mixture of inorganic and organic material is what we call soil. Okay, so as the soil starts to build up, other kinds of vegetation that require deeper soils can grow there. So things like herbs and weeds start to grow first after you get some good soil, and then eventually you get grasses in this area. Okay, so notice that these are stages through time, and again that they're getting replaced. Eventually grasses are replaced by shrubs that may be able to start to grow now that we have even more soil. Okay, other things are beginning to influence our community here. Again, we've got decades, maybe 100 years, right? So these taller shrubs and starting to get some immature pines that grow in here, they start to change the quality of the community as well by providing shade, by changing the acidity and nutrients within the soil, right? So the nutrient levels of the soils are changing, and that may provide opportunities for deciduous trees like hickories and oaks to come in, okay? And then finally, our climax community may consist of trees and those that tend to shade out the earlier successional stages and end up being the dominant trees that are found there, so like oaks, hickories, walnuts, beeches, okay, any of these examples here. This isn't necessarily exactly how every primary succession is going to take place, and we're going to talk about that, but these are examples of communities of climax species in a primary succession. Notice that a secondary succession can look similar. It's just that we already have the soil formed here. So when a fire destroys everything, the soil is still here. In fact, the burning of vegetation can add nutrients to the soil. And so these pioneer stages may come back pretty quickly. Within the first couple of years, there may be annual plants, grasses, and perennials growing by 3 or 4 years from now, right? And then the intermediate species can come in anywhere from 5 to 150 years later, depending on how dense the forest might be. And then finally, the mature oak and hickory forest that forms the climax community may finally be established here. And as we're going to talk about, there are processes that cause these replacements, the facilitation of the community for other species, as well as the inhibition of other species that can't grow in this community anymore once a certain stage is reached. Okay. This diagram shows the relationship between primary succession and secondary succession, and also illustrates the fact that it's not quite as linear as those two previous diagrams would have us believe. Okay, so if we start here in an area where there's no life, primary successions can take place so that we reach a pioneer stage, right? And then from this point, from pioneer stages on, then we're talking about secondary succession in here to intermediate stages to a climax stage. Okay, so notice all these arrows here that disturbances can occur at different times. So if we have reached a climax stage, an intense disturbance can set it back to any previous stage. It may just be a smaller disturbance that takes us back to this intermediate stage here, and maybe a bigger disturbance that takes us back to a pioneer stage here, or maybe a huge disturbance like a volcanic eruption or strip mining where there's no life and takes us all the way back to the beginning. Okay, so these black arrows here are agents of changes, disturbances, and stresses that cause a setback. Okay, and that the successions can occur so that there's some life, and then you have an intermediate stage that may cause a disturbance back to a pioneer stage, or that we may actually get, sorry I'm drawing so much on here, but we may get intermediate stage, and that may stay stable for a while because of a constant disturbance before we maybe proceed from this intermediate stage to a climax stage. So hopefully you kind of get the idea that there's interconnection between primary and secondary succession, and that disturbances can occur at any point in time. Okay, and that these stages that we were talking about before are usually not quite as predictable as or as linear as it may have seemed from those previous two slides. One of the things that's nice about some systems like dune systems is that they offer the opportunity to look at changes through time, but in a spatial representation. Okay, so you may go out to this beach here and walk from the edge of the water across the sand and come to the front edge of the dune and see some vegetation here. And then as you keep walking higher into the dune system, you may see different kinds of vegetation as you keep walking back and further away from the shoreline. So in this diagram here, you can see how the community is changing here and how the deposition of the sand has built up over time. Okay, so when I say it's changing, if you're just walking, it may take you just a few minutes to walk out here, right? But this can represent stages in time, because what's happened is that as sea level may have dropped, okay, or as sand is continually deposited here, these changes in space that we see, these spatial changes, can represent changes through time or temporal changes. Right? So that what's going to be the newest community here? Well, if sand was somewhat recently deposited, these communities are going to be a lot more recently growing here than these communities back here that would have formed much longer ago and have had much more time to develop. So we see these changes through time, again, represented by space. I hope that makes sense. One famous example of primary succession is the glacial retreat in Glacier Bay, Alaska. And this photograph shows the edge of the glacier here and how the glacier used to come all the way out here, and as it's melted, it's gone back further and further and further, and we can assume that as it continues to melt, it will just keep retreating further back. So this is actually a really famous example of primary succession because, again, it's been studied really well. These are just two different pictures of the glacial retreat dates for Glacier Bay, Alaska. You can see that right here, the glacier in 1750 extended here, and that by 1794, glacial ice was this far back, and then by the 1800s, it was this far back. So you can see as it takes these other sort of pathways here that there are dates to which we can see when the last edge of the glacial ice appeared in different places. So 1911, 1966 up here, 1972. So glacial retreat going further back. This is just another diagram that essentially shows you the same thing as the previous slide, but you can just see the dates of where the ice had retreated here from 1794 back into the 1800s all the way to the 1990s. And so, again, the retreat of the glaciers as they left exposed bedrock behind completely devoid of life gives us an opportunity to study primary succession.